Hello and welcome to another edition of CCC Talks with Mark O'Loughlin and the Cloud Credential Council. Now today we're joined by Raven Solomon, who is a professional diversity, equity and inclusion speaker, author, researcher and strategist. And Raven, you're also recognized as a thought leader in the early talent development space, having founded the Center for Next Generational Leadership and Professional Development. And if that's not enough, you're also author of a book on leadership for young professionals. I love the title, Leading Your Parents, 25 Rules to Effective Multi-Generational Leadership for Millennials and Gen Z. We're going to get into that a little bit later. Well, Raven, thank you for joining us on CCC Talks. And tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Mark. I'm super excited about this conversation. As you mentioned, I do a number of things, but most of my time is spent really helping organizations prepare for the future through diversity, equity, and inclusion. So helping them really understand the generational business case for doing this crucial work and helping them begin doing that work. So I work a lot with leaders, specifically around inclusive leadership and also helping them integrate inclusion throughout their organization. So I spend most of my time in that space. As you mentioned, I did found the center, we call it for short, but ultimately that organization really specializes in developing the future talent of the workforce. And so we really focus on developing soft skills in millennials and Generation Z, because we know that, this digital age, this technological world has really led to us not depending so much on our soft skills, quote unquote, or people skills. And so that's really led to an underdevelopment of those skills within those two generations. And so I founded the center specifically to help close that gap. And so I found myself in this space just by way of my career. I started with this organization specifically in the consumer packaged goods space. I went into a managerial training program right out of college, ran a chip route for a little while, about a year, and then was handed my first team of 16 men who were old enough to be my parents. And so hence the title of the book. Because I had to figure out, as a young leader, as a millennial, how do I gain their respect? How do I earn their trust? How do I get them to truly see me as a capable leader? And so having done that, cracked the code on that, after I left that organization and really wanted to author some sort of book that would add value and contribute to the world that wasn't out there, I started to write about my experience within that organization and what I learned along the way to help young leaders, in essence, do the same thing, to lead their parents inside of the workplace.
So you have the best job ever. You didn't go looking for it. It found you and you've developed that. I think that's fascinating. And that's part of the story why we wanted to talk to you today. At the CCC, we're helping organizations prepare for the future with our digital portfolios. And we don't look too much on the technical side because that's by vendors, but we look more on the business side, managerial side. But then there's also this side, the soft skill side. And then what really interested me was I saw you talk about this 4 to 5 generations in the workplace at any one time, potentially. And I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But it goes back to what you were saying about your book. And you're now this young person having to lead these older people. And, they have a different view in the workplace of you.
Yeah.
And someone like you in your position is going to have to spend many years earning their trust or whatever that is, but you don't have that anymore. You don't go up through the ranks. It's not seniority based on years of service and all this kind of stuff. So we've totally changed in the workplace, and I think that's so relevant. And I guess that's what I wanted to talk to you today about. You mentioned people, diversity, and inclusion, and I think the effect of modernizing today with technology and digital services on top of all the other challenges we have. And you did mention there for the first time, or I've heard you mention that there can be about 4 to 5 generations in an organization, similar to you're one generation, these older folks are another generation, and everything in between. But to get us started, how should, in that case, leaders create that empathy and awareness? How did you start with that? Maybe that's where we should start.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And the way that I started, and I talk about this in my book, kind of probably the first chapter or at least the first
Yeah,
section, is all about understanding generational difference. I think that's really the first step. We've got to understand the differences that exist amongst us and why those differences
yeah,
exist, because the context is critical. I mean, if you
yeah,
just think about it, which oftentimes we don't, we
yeah,
just, encounter the difference and it creates the frustration, and we feel validated in our frustration and the way that we view other people. But if we just sit back and consider the context within which they grew up, right? The things that they had access to or didn't have access to,
yeah,
what was norm in their kind of coming of age or even coming into the workforce versus what's norm for us. What value systems did they grow up with and were embedded within their character versus what's now, being embedded in ours. And so if we have those moments of intentional awareness created by an organization to really give us this learning, this education, this understanding around what generations are, how they come to be, and why the differences exist amongst us, I think that's the first step. And so a lot of
mm,
organizations are indeed making that investment by way of folks like me, right? To provide that training and that
yeah,
awareness around why these differences exist. So I think starting with the understanding is critical. And then I think as a leader, it's important to really make sure that you're leveraging the generational differences that exist in your organization.
yes,
So it's
yes,
one thing for them to exist, that's diversity, but it's a completely different thing for them to actually be leveraged and utilized and engaged, right, to generate organizational outcomes. That's inclusion. And so it's really about being intentional in
yes,
creating diverse teams. In this case, we're speaking generationally, but creating those teams and ensuring that we're actually leveraging those differences, right? So if you think about a strength of a baby boomer, oftentimes those strengths counter the opportunity areas of a Gen Zer or a millennial.
yes,
Well, my
yes.
job as a leader is to figure out how I take, I won't say take advantage, but how I maximize and optimize those strengths and opportunities, right?
Yeah,
And so I think
and
that's
again,
the,
yeah, and I know there's no generation that's better than the other generation. There's no generation that's right or wrong. You might say an older generation might have more experience and be able to take risks with a broader because they've just experienced more. But
yeah,
that you don't need that in every situation. But then also you don't need the risk taker that experience in every
mhm,
situation either.
that's
So
right.
there's a lot to give from everybody, and I think the mindset is to understand. You said it there. Where are people's strengths? Where are the opportunities? Where can they give that?
Yeah.
It comes back to for the first time ever, we have a huge number of generations, the 4 to 5 generations in an organization that
Mhm.
are different.
Yeah.
If you go back 150 years ago, they weren't so big, they weren't as different because technology didn't change as much. The world didn't change as much. Change was slow. It did happen,
Mhm.
but it came around in hundreds of years rather than tens of years, which we're seeing now, which is
That's
strange.
exactly
But
right. Yeah, I
I guess,
completely agree.
yeah, in an organization that say who's interested in, reaching out to Raven and saying, Raven, we need some help on this. Is that generally the HR department?
Mm.
Or I'd be surprised now if it's elsewhere, but is it elsewhere within the organization? Is it CEO? Is it line managers? Who generally say call on you? Who's seeing this as a problem?
That's a really, really good question because it varies, honestly. So a lot of the times it's the chief diversity officer or
Yeah,
those working within the diversity office or
yeah,
department. Oftentimes it's HR for
yeah,
sure, but a lot of times it's leaders themselves, right? Leaders
good,
who are either
good.
leading sales organizations or
Yeah,
leading technology businesses, or I get actually a lot of work in tech, or in IT or what have you. Within
yeah,
big corporations, and the IT leaders within those corporations will say, we've got an issue here within our team because I mean, if you just think about the type of mind that is typically most successful in a technological role, there is opportunity more often than not
Yeah.
within those types of individuals, not to be biased, but it's certainly biased. But
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
oftentimes this opportunity area to really develop the soft skill around how to be inclusive and how to really be empathetic to the differences and the experiences of others, because oftentimes we who are in technology think very linearly, but inclusion is real. It's not linear at all. In fact,
Yeah.
it's the exact
Yeah.
opposite. So I get a lot of work in the tech space, honestly.
That's good. And I'm really happy to hear it's not just HR, that it's not just a fail-safe HR tick box type thing, or they're the only people seeing this and then trying to push it into an organization, because
Yeah.
that's very challenging. But
Mhm.
to hear that leaders are saying, Raven, we need some help here. We recognize that we've looked around and we see we
Mhm.
have diversity. We see but not everything's inclusion is where we want to go as well.
Yeah.
Um, and you talk a lot about, I think know the answer, but I'll ask anyway, because you talk a lot about the Gen Z cohort, those Gen Z folks. And they're the folks born between 1997 and 2012. Why do you focus in on the Gen Z? Um,
Yeah, they are, simply put, the future of our
yeah,
society. They're the future of our
yeah,
workplace. They're
yeah,
the future of our communities. I mean, I think at every turn of the generational, you know, majority, if you will, or this generation of young people. We always just use the terms young people. At every turn of that, we are keenly focused on that generation, because we know that they're going to come in and really desire and demand, quite frankly, something totally different. We saw
yeah,
it with millennials. I mean, within my remembrance in my years of of life, we definitely, the first time I remember it is when millennials, my generation, was
yeah,
coming into the workplace. Every article you read was about millennials.
yeah, yeah,
Every YouTube channel, if you just research or Google generations, that you were going to come up with 100 different videos about millennials, whether they were accurate or not, right? And so that generation now is Gen Z. They are massive in number. They are the largest living generation in the
yes,
United States, and I
yeah,
think globally as well.
yeah, that's
They
true.
are also the most diverse generation we've ever seen in the US, speaking in particular from a racial and ethnic standpoint, but also I think globally from a gender standpoint, right? Gender identity within that generation, just the
Mm,
thinking around that is vastly
yeah,
different than perhaps it has been in the past. And so, what they're growing up with in terms of just common language and the everyday diversity that they're used to, it is going to really, really put a demand on organizations to truly embrace that, to adopt that, and to create equitable policies, practices, procedures, et
yeah,
cetera, to support that. And so that's why I talk a lot about Gen Z. They're about to be a quarter of the workforce in just
yeah.
5 or 6 years. And so if we're not yet ready for their infiltration, then we have to get ready. And a big part of that is around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I love that. If we're not ready, we have to get ready. That's so true, because they do think different. Now, again, not to pick on any cohort. It's not to say these are negatives. These are positives.
Yeah.
They think different. They act different. They come from a different space, more so than the generations before them. And we do want to use them in organizations, but we've got to plug them in to the organization. We've got to extract from them the good stuff, but they also have to fit in to with the other generations. But it's never the
Yeah.
same. When you're younger, you tend not to think that way as well. When you're older, you've been there, you've seen it all. You go, okay, what's today's change? Okay, we'll make that happen, or we'll do that happen.
Yeah.
And
You're a
then
little more
look at
adaptive.
these, yeah, but then we look at these young folks and call them upstarts and things like that.
Mhm.
So it's like a big soup with
Yeah.
everything melting, or a big melting pot with everything melting in, and we have another cohort to put in here. And yet they have totally different experiences from the world that they live in and they were born into and what
Yeah.
they see. But
Yeah.
certainly we need to blend that with the experiences of everybody else. And I
Yeah.
think that's what gets a super organization.
Yeah.
And I guess
And to your
talking
point,
about
Mark,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, to your point,
Yeah.
the work that I do, I work a lot with leaders and organizations in preparation for the diversity of the
Yeah.
future in Gen Z. But I also work a lot with Gen Z on how to adapt to this structure and the system
Yeah.
that they're about to walk into that they're so frustrated with. And so it has to happen on both sides. Yes, I've
Yeah.
got to, prepare and get ready these organizations that need to figure out how they adopt these new ways of thinking that Gen Z is going to usher in. But at the same time, we also have to be realistic, and we also have to have these really, really important and critical professional development conversations and workshops with Gen Z to really help them understand how to navigate these spaces, to understand how and why the change that you're asking for may not actually come about, or
Yeah.
it may
Yeah.
not be in your lifetime, right? And so that's why I also founded the center. It has to happen on both sides.
That's right, because the world they're coming from, never in history before, is less restraint than the past.
Yeah.
They've more control, they've more freedoms than people have ever had
Mm-hmm.
and experienced. And then, as you said, you put them into this corporate structure
Yeah.
where it's not the same. And yeah, frustration can be very quick and very ripe. So that's an interesting point, that they also have to be educated or educate themselves
Mm-hmm.
to come into the system. Not to, but I imagine that the system, we see changes in the system now.
Yeah.
Like the 9 to 5 is going away.
Mm-hmm.
COVID has kind of accelerated that with remote working and allowing the systems to be more flexible,
Yeah.
which is good for this cohort.
Yeah.
So there'll be a good change there. And what else do millennials and Gen Z want from companies? Is it just I work whenever I want? Is it flip flops on a Friday kind of thing? What do they want in your experience?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that, because I think that there is a misunderstanding around what these generations want. We think it's the ping pong tables and the beer on tap and the flexible attire, all of those things. And while that may be value adding to some, I would argue to very few millennials and Gen Zers. What I see that I'll kind of talk about them separately, although there are some commonalities between the two. But when it comes to millennials, what I see that many millennials want and have wanted first is meaning and purpose in their work, right? We often think that, if I put the ping pong table in, I'll be able to retain them, even if I want them to work a meaningless role and to work all types of the night. It's not going to happen. So work-life balance is another one, right? These are the meaningful things that I think millennials are looking for, and what they're willing to leave your organization in pursuit of. And so, millennials got the bad rap of being company hoppers and being disloyal to one organization and having 10 companies on their resume before they've reached 5 years in career. And so they developed this bad reputation of that. But I think what that was, it really was a difference in priorities of values. And so while baby boomers really saw loyalty to company as noteworthy and notable, millennials are more loyal to themselves, right? And so and their desire for meaning and purpose in their work. And so I'm going to pursue that versus being loyal to an organization. And so it looks like I'm disloyal, but I really am just loyal to my life and what I desire to bring into the world. So I would say meaning and purpose, and also work-life balance for millennials. Career progression as well is a strong value. And then with Gen Z, those things are also true for all three of them are true for Gen Z. But in addition to that, I would add financial security is something that we see as a desire for Gen Z that we didn't see as early for millennials. Millennials were all about kind of experiences over things, right? We wanted we'll pay the $50 for the gold burger, and we just want to take the vacation to Bali, and we want the experience. However, what we see with Gen Z is kind of, while those things are cool, they saw their parents go through this great recession, at least here in the US. They've seen a lot, and so they are very financially aware and more financially literate early on in their lives than we have seen in past generations. And so the last thing I'll add for Gen Z is just follow through, right? I talk a lot about how organizations the promises, the good statements, the creeds, the missions, and the values, but those that aren't lived out in the organization. Gen Z is that generation that's going to challenge you against that. It's going to call you out against that, and they're going to leave if they don't see follow through on the things that we say are important to us and the things that we say we're going to do. And if you think about it, they've experienced a lot that's kind of led them to distrust structures, power structures in particular. And so I think that's what's led to this kind of demand for follow through before I can trust you as a leader, and certainly as a organization that I'm going to spend decades with,
Yeah, I think that's so insightful. By the way, I've never had a $50 gold burger. But I may go and check out what one of those things is. I don't think I could spend $50 on any burger whatsoever. But it's so interesting, as you said, with financial security based on we've come out of the global financial crash, and also I think when you mentioned loyalty as well for either cohort, what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years with organizations is a lack of loyalty to the employees. That they can treat them as expendable. The financial crash showed that how many layoffs happen just straight away, rather than we'll try and keep people and there's careers. The whole thing of a 40-year career is over as well. So that's where their thinking is come from, where the baby boomers, Gen X, the other generations have a different view, a different world to come from, where they look at stability. And now we've gone into full circle into financial security, but with a view of not having a 40-year career in one company, as you said, with having 10 areas that you've worked in on a CV for 5 years. That is the new type of career, I think. You're showing flexibility, and it will suit some organizations, it won't suit others, but we're in this, again, melting pot where that's reality. And the world has changed away from, well, if you want loyalty from your staff, you must give loyalty back. And I think we've lost a bit of that in the world. And the other thing, I guess, is, with these two generations looking at the world going, is this the best that they've come up with?
That's right. That is exactly right.
There's better ways to do this. There's better ways to work. There's better ways to make profit. There's better ways to do things. And there's better ways for me to live my life without having to work my life, that kind of thing. So
that's right. That's exactly right. You're spot on. And they're going to vocalize that, which is just different from past generations, right? I talk about how baby boomers grew up in a time where, children were seen and not heard. And you just had a certain degree of respect for authority and hierarchy. And, so when you translate that into the workplace, baby boomers at the age of 22 weren't trying to have conversations with the CEO and provide feedback and layers of accountability throughout the lower ends of the organization. But this generation just is. They grew up very vocally empowered as children. And so they're used to having a say-so, and they've been emboldened to have difficult conversations and not afraid to give feedback in that regard. Let me ask you a question, Mark. Those things that I just kind of rattled off around millennials and Gen Z, do you see similar characteristics in those generations in Ireland as well?
Yeah, being put on the spot. Hey, that's I do. As you're going through them in my head, I'm going, yes, and yes. The difference, I wasn't sure about the difference, but when you said about Gen Z and financial, linking it back to, we've gone through that financial crash, globally hit, and I was looking at that, growing it into the workspace, and probably saying, okay, I need to be protected against that, but I'm carrying the millennial mindset because I was influenced by that more than any other generation. And this is how I see how we're going to work and how we're going to try and fit into. It's about fitting into to space, work, whatever, life. I do relate to those, what you've said, and I think it does help. Maybe it helps our listeners as well, because that's where they're coming from. As well. It's not disobedience. It's not I'm trying to take your job. It's not as you said, I want to be talking to the CEO on a power trip thing. It's I want meaning and purpose, and this is how I go about it. And these are the traits that are so important to me.
Yeah.
for that cohort. And I think that's why your work is so fundamental in helping us all in the workplace remember this, because work is too busy these days. We don't have slack. We don't have free time.
Mhm.
We don't have time to think about these things. We just have time to react.
Yeah.
And all these different things coming in. As I said, a workplace now, any workplace with more than two generations is a melting pot, but it can be so positive if we can understand it and work with it.
That's
Or
right.
it can be absolutely nightmarish, possibly for everybody, if we
Yeah.
don't. So
Absolutely.
we need more of you. We need more of you. Can I ask though, with all these differences, how do we teach and lead the Gen Z cohort today? Do organizations now have to adapt how they actually teach and lead? Do
Mhm.
they, even from the sake of just teaching, training, and education? So we do a lot in the education space, but
Mhm.
do the traditional ways work anymore, or does online work? Is that better? Is group-based learning better? Is individual learning better? Or do we just have to re-examine the learning because these think differently and absorb differently? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's kind of all of the above in a sense.
Mm,
I think what we have to do is ultimately reassess how we provide education to just people, right? I mean,
yeah,
I think about here in the U.S., we've had this antiquated way of educating for
yeah,
centuries,
yeah,
and it's just this download of information. There's this instructor in front of the classroom, and then there are groups of students, right? And there's
yeah,
just this conversation that's one-sided oftentimes
yeah,
until you get to the collegiate level. And so I think, it's just time that we rethink how we educate people, and certainly these next generations that we see, Gen Z and also Gen Alpha, which is the following generation after
yeah,
Gen
yeah,
Z. If you think about what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis versus what perhaps even you and I experience, and our parents and our parents' parents, we should be changing the way that we reach them. If
yeah,
everything is now being kind of pushed to them, if you will, via technology. But the issue is you also have to consider, for lack of better words, attention span, and
yeah,
how that is going to impact even online learning. And so you've got to have this balance. I always try to admonish folks to consider. It's like, how do you find a balance between online learning, also kinesthetic hands-on experiences, also between video and audio, and
yeah,
balancing
yeah,
that. So you're gonna need this variety of
yeah,
avenues and modalities to reach and truly create points of awareness. I like to say it this way about Gen Z: they really prefer to construct versus be instructed. So they prefer to be a part of the learning experience. And so you also want to infuse points of engagement and
yeah,
interaction, and the ability to contribute to the learning
yeah,
environment, as
yes,
well as the learning itself, because they're very, very smart, very, very smart.
yeah.
And so how do you create a learning environment that is co-constructed versus just this instruction consistently? It are the questions that I would encourage educators and those developing systems for education to think about.
We got to get you on the university tour and educate them there. I love that. Did you say, am I right in saying they prefer to construct rather than instruct?
Yeah, that's
Oh,
right.
I love that. That just touched something with me there because it just me. Yeah, that I think you're on something with that. They want to contribute to the learning, not just have it one way.
Yeah.
And that's not just hands on, but that is a two-way thing. And
Mhm.
I do think we do need to change education to go that way, and we need to do it sooner than later. Even
Yeah.
COVID has shown us that just moving your lecture online, having somebody lecture you for an hour or two online, just in a single broadcast, is mind numbing. You
Yeah.
got to do it differently. You can still do a 2 hour session with people, but get them engaged, get them to construct rather than you instruct. Oh, I
That's
like that. You have to
right.
think about that. and variety then as well in the learning space. As you said, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we learned differently. In the 90s, some changes. Then online came, but the variety, we now have a lot of options for it that we didn't have in the past. And
Yeah.
again, they're different minds. And I love what you said there as well about educating people. So we didn't go around educating Gen X or Y or whatever. It was just educating people because it's, we're all people at the end of the day. And I think these are labels we just put on to understand
Yeah,
maybe how the minds change a little bit. Yeah,
exactly.
we're also at the time, speaking of labels now, we've got Generation X, we've got the baby boomers, and those are the folks that were born between, say, 1955 and 80, all in the organization as well as these other generations. But are they starting to feel more excluded the more we get into digital organization, digital technologies, and digital natives? People coming in, I was born in digital, and all these other folks here weren't, and having to be pulled into this digital age.
Yeah.
Are they getting excluded? Are their careers in decline? Do they feel they've less to give? Are they under pressure?
Yeah. I mean, that's a loaded question for sure. But I think if you look at the generational diversity and the age mix in technology companies,
Yeah,
it skews far younger, right?
yeah,
And so are they being excluded? I think so. I think so.
yeah.
And, in many countries, that's illegal. And so we need to think about that for many
Yeah.
other reasons. But I will say that just from a self-reflective standpoint for a baby boomer or a Gen Xer, I think that, yeah, some baby boomers certainly are feeling this sense of exclusion, feeling like
Mm,
this has outgrown me now, feeling like
yeah,
this is beyond me. It's too much for me to catch up and to now learn. I just
yeah,
need to simply call it quits, retire, do something different. So
yeah,
I do see a ton of that. And also, we see here in the US that 10,000 baby boomers a day are retiring. So baby boomers have just reached that retirement age.
yes, yes,
And so that's kind of natural. I will say for Gen X, though, Gen X is actually very tech savvy and tech
yes,
inquisitive. I don't think they get enough credit for their ability to navigate technology, having not grown up with it at all. And so I think Gen X is one of those generations that has not only figured out technology and has figured out how to adapt. They're a very small generation too. And so I think a lot of Gen Xers feel like we don't have a choice but to adapt. We're still
yes,
between these two massive generations. We're
yes,
often forgotten about. So we have to, make our own way and be successful. So not only have they figured out how to navigate technology, but they figured out how to create technology. A lot of,
yes,
the technology we use today was created by Gen Xers. And so they're also at that age, if you will, stage in their career where they're leading organizations at this point. They
yes,
are the CEOs and the C-suite and the SVPs, et cetera.
yeah.
So I don't think Gen X is behind by any means when it comes to technology. All of my Gen X cousins are all over Facebook and they try to find their way to TikTok and then they find their way, so they're very, very open, honestly,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
technology, which I love.
And that's interesting. Well, they might find their way to TikTok. They just might not look cool on TikTok. but that's a different thing. And I guess the Gen X, I mean, in those age from you're going back to the 70s there and a little bit into the 80s. They as you said, they created the technologies. They were given things and go make that work. Whereas
Mhm.
today, I think the new generations are creating software.
That's right.
The technologies are there. So again, it is that creative mind which might actually get them through this change.
Yeah.
Ray, we also talk a lot about diversity. That's hugely important. Now, diversity in everything, in markets, organization, talents, people's ideas.
Mhm.
And you talk about racial equity, and I guess how important that is as well. So I have heard you talk about where generational diversity and racial equity intersect.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. It was very
Yeah.
interesting.
To me, it really is about the future of work at the end of the day. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, you think about generational diversity, we're oftentimes thinking about the future of our organizations, the youngest
yeah,
generation coming in, so Gen Z. And then within the racial equity component, I think about the intersection of Gen Z and race. I mean, as I mentioned, they are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation that we've ever seen. And
Yes.
so they are the future. And so by innate, virtue, the future is diverse, and it's only going to get more and more diverse. Gen Alpha is even more diverse. And so to me, the intersection of generational diversity and racial equity is to really examine the future of diversity and to truly do the work to create equitable organizations so that when that diversity arrives, we actually have inclusive cultures and we actually have equitable and sustainably equitable policies and practices, et cetera. So to me, that's that intersection. You can't talk about racial equity, I don't think, without talking about generations and generational diversity.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't think you can talk about generations without talking about equity at this point for that reason.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to ask you about that, because I have heard you talk about that, and I think it's so important that we plan for it now. And as you said, we've never been as diverse as today, and we're only going to get more diverse.
That's
So
right.
let's get inclusive about it. Let's get inclusive about it. It's interesting. I can't wait to see when the Gen Alphas generate
I know.
what comes out. I can't wait to see. I'm on the fence. I'm not sure.
If we continue on this trend that I see and all of these trends, I just don't know that we're ready. I cannot imagine. I mean, I have a niece who is 2 years old. She's about to be 2, and the way that technology is just the norm for her is it's baffling. It's baffling. I mean, when she was younger than 1, she's swiping on cell phones, and we try to manage her intake of technology and screen time and all of those things. But how possible and probable is that? And I just don't know what the future holds for that generation.
You can almost see a change in it when you look at them, because they become more digital literate very early on. They've no problem using the technologies in this, but their attention span diminishes significantly over, with the new cohorts that we see. So it'll be interesting to see how we deal with that. But as your attention span diminishes then as well, I guess stress may rise a little bit too, because you're in an always on world, always connected, where our baby boomer friends weren't and like to live that way too.
You can turn it off.
Yeah, they can turn it off. So it'd be interesting to see. Now, I wanted to go back to Gen Z. I wanted to ask you this question, the title of your book. So tell us, why should Gen Z be leading their parents, as you titled your book? What's that all about? Why should they be telling us what to do?
Well, I don't know that they should, but the reality is that they are, right? And that they will be, whether we like it or not. They are going to be in these leadership positions similar to millennials, right? As I mentioned with my career, coming out of college, I was 21, 22 years old, leading teams of folks in their 60s and 50s. And I'm sure that they didn't like that too much, at least to begin with. But the reality is there was an organizational value here. There was an objective from the organization and a rationale as to why they needed to do that, and are going to continue to lean into bringing in, this early talent, inserting them into managerial positions so that they can, succession plan, which is the smart thing to do. That's a part of it. I'm sure also it's cheaper, and there are other business reasons why I'm sure that makes sense. But nonetheless, the reality is it is a reality. And so that's why my job through that book is to really prepare that generation as to how to do that, how to do it respectfully, how to do it, with candor and truth, but also with maturity and, and to navigate it and to do it successfully at the end of the day. I saw a lot of my peers just not be successful in those types of roles. And it really boiled down to soft skills. And so what I will say about Gen Z and what we see in the data is that they are decently self-aware of these opportunity areas in the soft skill area. They know that they're tech dependent, right? They know that impacts their ability to sometimes verbally communicate with comfort and confidence. Right? So they know this, and they're, I think, wanting organizations and institutions to help subsidize that with quality professional development opportunities. And so I will say that about them. And I think this book often helps them because they get it. They want to learn it. They just have not been taught by way of these institutions. And so that's why.
I'm not, as you said, no, we don't get taught this in institutions and universities in third level. We don't get taught that, and it needs to change. I just had it came to me there, as you said, when you think about the baby boomers from, say, the 60s, if you're to write a book back then, I'm not saying you, but a book written back then would probably be titled Obey Your Parents.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're in this world with the Gen Z, and you're writing a book about lead your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And now I prefer lead your parents to obey, because the obey system is just too authoritarian there. But I just, that's amazing. We've done that in a couple of these generations, which I think is interesting. And you also talk about 6 things you need to know to lead Gen Z. What would be top of that list? What would be top of that you could tell our listeners to think about?
Yeah. So I think you're referencing an article that I recently wrote. And so, yeah, it can be found on my website too, because obviously we can't go through all 6 of them. But
Yeah.
I think it's really, really, if I'm a leader and I'm trying to prepare my organization for this next generation, these are the top 6 things I was thinking about. I would admonish folks to think about. So the first one is really about being open and honest. So honest, open, and transparent.
Yeah.
So being prepared to be that way. I mentioned earlier that they're looking for follow through. They've got this distrust of power structures and systems for a reason, right? For many reasons. If you think about it, they log onto their phones, they log into Instagram or TikTok, they're inundated with advertisements, and it's hard sometimes to decipher between what is actually real and what is not, what is actually valid and what's coming at me because they want me to buy something, and so forth and so on. And so with that, you've got to be extremely open and honest and transparent with them in order to really build trust and to deposit into that emotional bank account with them so that they actually trust you. So that's the number one thing. And maybe the second one is really being prepared to provide a lot of feedback. If you think millennials needed a lot of feedback, this generation.
Oh dear, so some folks aren't going to do too well with that. But you're right, we do need feedback, and the way the generation has grown up, they get feedback all the time now from everything that they go around, that they interact with. So it should be no different than work. But how many management structures do we have that have that yearly feedback system, once a year, linked to your pay and all this, and that's it done? A manager goes off and manages things that they think are important. I think your people are important.
That's
because
right.
If you don't get the people right, you don't get the product right, you don't get the customer service right, you don't get other things right. And the people are changing. So feedback would be so important. Now, Raven, as you mentioned there, stuff on your website. Tell us a little bit more about where people can find out about your work.
Yeah. So my website is www.ravensolomon.com. I'm also very active on LinkedIn, constantly contributing thoughts and pieces there. I've got a newsletter on LinkedIn, so I certainly encourage folks to check that out. Also, my podcast. I mean, I think if you're looking to learn more about Gen Z, we did an entire series this year about Gen Z, talking to Gen Zers of all different backgrounds, talking to parents of Gen Zers and managers. So I would strongly encourage folks to check out the Generational View podcast as well.
Great. And we'll recommend that because we've had a look at some of them too, and they're fantastic. They're really good. And as you said, you've gone right to the source. You've asked them. Then you've asked the parents, because you're telling them to lead their parents. So people can listen into that. Listen, Raven, we'll finish up with a final question for you. Now, what's the first thing that you recommend listeners should think about in order to develop an effective multi-generational leadership, for millennials and Gen Z? Again, what's that first thing you'd leave us with?
I think listen. Yeah, go sit, ask, and listen to them. And I promise you, what they have to share is going to challenge you personally. It's going to challenge you as a leader, and it's also going to inspire major change within your organization. But too often we're the ones doing the talking, but not doing enough listening. So if I'm a leader, I would first just listen, set aside some time and listen.
Love that. Listen, absorb, and lead.
That's right.
Take the feedback and lead. Be a leader, but be a new leader in this new world. and lead differently. I think that's fantastic to finish on. Raven Solomon, thank you so much for joining us today on CCC Talks.
Thank you for having me.